The Elder Scrolls timeline begins before Empire, before Dragonborn, and before history can be trusted. The oldest accounts place that start in the Dawn era, when myth and reality overlap so closely that even the sources disagree on what was literal and what was later interpretation. That uncertainty is part of what makes the timeline worth tracing. It shows how a world of creation stories hardens into history, with gods, elves, humans, and empires all leaving marks that can still be followed from one age to the next. To understand Skyrim, you have to begin where Tamriel does, in the unstable years before time was fully settled. From there, the first major shift is the move into the Merethic and First eras, when legend starts becoming record. In the Dawn era, the main challenge for any timeline is that time itself is still unsettled. Elder Scrolls treats this age as a creation period, where gods, spirits, and the making of the world overlap. Nirn does not begin as a finished planet with fixed borders and clean chronology. It emerges through conflict, sacrifice, and division among the powers that shaped it. The Daedra are tied to that act of creation and the limits it imposed on the mortal world. The Daedra remain more separate, closer to personal power and independent rule. From the start, the setting is built around that split, those who helped make the world and those who stood apart from it. That split matters because the early myths become the backbone of everything that follows. Later eras are easier to trace through politics and war, but the older creation stories never stop shaping the cultures of Tamriel. Every major people inherits some version of them, and those versions often disagree. Even so, they all point to the same broad idea. The world was formed through struggle before it was organized by law. Nirn, Tamriel, and the mortal races come out of collapse and aftermath, not calm order. In this age, myth and history are still so close that they blur together, which is why later civilizations keep returning to these first stories. They are not just religion, they are the starting point for how Tamriel understands itself. The shift from the Dawn era into the Merethic era is where the timeline begins to settle into something more usable. This is the first major turning point, because the world starts behaving like a place with continuity. The Merethic era is still ancient and often unclear, but it is no longer pure creation myth. The earliest elves begin to appear in Tamrielic history, especially the ancestors of the Aldmer, the Old Folk, from whom many later elven groups descend. Their arrival is one of the defining events of the period. It marks the beginning of recognizable settlement, identity, and division across the continent. Once the Aldmer and related peoples establish themselves, Tamriel's history starts to look less like cosmology and more like a record of migration, settlement, and inheritance. From there, the early history of Tamriel becomes a story of separation. Different elven groups spread into different regions and develop different traditions. The Altmer preserve ideas of continuity and refinement. The Kimmer break from older elven expectations and follow their own course. The Bosmer, Iliads, Dwemer, and other early peoples each claim a distinct place in the world. Before the great empires, Tamriel is already divided by competing histories and competing ideas about legitimacy. Those divisions are not only political, they are cultural and spiritual as well, shaping how each group understands ancestry, law, and the gods. This is the point where the continent stops being an empty backdrop and becomes a patchwork of societies with different customs and different claims to the future. The Merethic era is also when the first major tensions around religion and identity begin to take shape. The ancestors of later human kingdoms are present in the background, even before they dominate the continent. The Nords arrive in Skyrim during this broader period, and that arrival matters because it introduces a human power that will eventually challenge elven control in large parts of Tamriel. In the northwest, early human and elven communities are already laying the groundwork for conflicts that will last for generations. The focus of history shifts here from origin to struggle over land, faith, and rule. As human settlement expands, the question is no longer only where people came from, it becomes who gets to stay, who gets to rule, and whose version of the world will endure. By the late Merethic era, the world starts to feel genuinely historical. Early Nordic culture takes shape, elven influence spreads, and the pressure between humans and elves becomes harder to ignore. The oldest legends now lead toward organized societies, permanent settlements, and the first long conflicts over Tamriel's future. The pattern is already visible. The cost of creation has left a mortal world behind, and that world is filling with peoples who want to define their place in it. By the end of this early stretch, the setting has changed completely. It has moved from creation myth into the first age of civilizations with distinct peoples, competing traditions, and the foundations of later empires. That is the bridge between the Dawn and Merethic eras. The First Era is where Elder Scrolls history stops feeling purely legendary and starts reading like a record of kingdoms, wars, and failing empires. Humans expand across Tamriel, elven states fight to hold their ground, and religion becomes a political force in its own right. By this point, the continent is no longer a loose scattering of early peoples. It has real centers of power, and those centers begin colliding almost immediately. In the north, the early Nords become one of the first major human powers to reshape Tamriel through conquest. Their arrival does not just add another people to the map. It shifts the balance of power and draws them into conflict with the elven nations already established there, especially the Snow Elf realms. Those wars sit at the center of early Skyrim's history and the wider human challenge to Merethic Era elven dominance. The same pattern keeps repeating. Humans organize, expand, and build new states, while elven powers resist, adapt, or break apart under pressure. The era opens with movement and ends with borders that look very different from where they began. That tension is even clearer in Cyrodiil. There, the Eyelids, or Heartland High Elves, build a powerful civilization with deep roots in the region. Their rule is political, religious, and dependent on slavery, which creates the conditions for rebellion. That revolt becomes one of the major turning points in the timeline, because it ends Eyelid dominance in Cyrodiil and opens the path toward the first durable human empire in the region. The fall of Eyelid rule is not just a change in leadership, it marks the moment humans begin claiming not only the right to survive on Tamriel, but the right to govern it. Alessia is central to that change. Her rebellion matters because it does more than replace one ruler with another. It creates a new political model, combining conquest, religion, and legitimacy into a single imperial idea. The state that grows out of her victory becomes the foundation for later Cyrodiilic rule, and the Alessian order helps turn that victory into a lasting religious and social system. In the short term, that order strengthens the new regime. Over time, it also creates instability, because reform in Tamriel rarely stays contained. Once a movement claims authority to remake society, it usually ends up challenging its own allies as well. The First Era shows that clearly the same force that unifies one region can unsettle the next. The Alessian order becomes one of the clearest examples of faith reshaping politics across the continent. Its influence spreads beyond Cyrodiil, and its reforms bring it into conflict with neighboring regions and older traditions. The result is a more unified human power in the center of Tamriel, but also a more rigid and divisive one. Instead of settling the continent, the new order creates fresh pressure points. Religious authority is no longer just a background force. It becomes a source of law, conflict, and social control, which means political disputes are increasingly tied to doctrine and legitimacy. In the west and south, the elven powers of Somerset and High Rock remain important, though not always in the same form. The Durrani hegemony stands out as a long-lived elven power base in High Rock, especially in the early and middle parts of the era. It shows that the rise of humans is not a clean replacement of elven rule. In some regions, elven nobility and human populations coexist for centuries, creating mixed political structures instead of simple victories. Tamriel in this period is full of overlapping claims, inherited authority, and contested borders. Power often belongs to whoever can hold a region together long enough to turn occupation into custom and custom into law. That is why some areas change hands quickly, while others remain split for generations. Farther east, Morrowind develops along its own path. The Kaima, later known as Dunmer, remains separate from the main Cyrodiilic and Nordic struggles for much of the era, but they are never outside history. Their politics, religion, and conflicts with neighboring powers add to the larger pattern of fragmentation across Tamriel. The rise of the Tribunal belongs to this same First-Era transformation, where older peoples become more organized and more distinct, even as war, migration, and divine claims press in around them. Morrowind's history in this period shows that the First Era is not only about humans replacing elves, it is also about every major culture hardening into a more defined identity under pressure. One of the most unusual systems of the era is the dragon cult in Skyrim. In early Nordic history, dragons are not just beasts or relics. They are tied to religious authority and rulership, with dragon priests forming a central part of that order. That matters because it shows how myth and government overlap in Elder Scrolls history. The dragon cult is one of the oldest examples of a state-like structure built around worship and hierarchy, and its collapse changes Skyrim permanently. When that system falls, it does more than remove a priesthood. It breaks a whole model of rule, forcing the Nords away from divine hierarchy and towards something more dependent on mortal leadership. The First Era is also filled with wars that do not stay neatly inside one region. There are imperial conflicts, local revolts, border struggles, and succession disputes that keep Tamriel unstable for centuries. Wars between men and mer build on one another, and disputes over religion or legitimacy keep feeding the cycle. The continent is not moving toward one clean empire. It is moving through repeated attempts at empire, each one leaving behind new divisions. Even when a kingdom wins, it often inherits the burdens of the system it overthrew. Even when a reform movement succeeds, it often creates the next round of conflict. By the end of the First Era, Tamriel is still not unified. It is more politically developed, more institutionally complex, and more tightly connected than before, but it is also more fractured. Human kingdoms have risen to challenge elven control. The Ellesian Order has turned religion into statecraft. Skyrim has its own history of dragon-backed rule and revolt, and all of it leaves the continent divided by competing traditions and claims to legitimacy. The First Era does not resolve Tamriel's long struggle. The Second Era begins with the collapse of the Riemann Empire, and that break changes everything that follows. Tamriel does not enter a clean age of recovery. It enters a long period of political uncertainty where the old imperial center is gone and no new power can fully replace it. If the First Era ends in exhaustion, the second begins in fragmentation. The immediate turning point is the end of Riemann rule. The Riemann dynasty had been one of the few forces capable of uniting much of Tamriel under a single imperial structure, but once that line is gone, the center no longer holds. What follows is the interregnum, a stretch of instability so long that it becomes one of the era's defining features. Cyrodiil stops functioning as a stable imperial core. Rulers and factions rise and fall, but none can fully restore the old order. Kings, warlords, councils, and local powers fill the vacuum. Borders grow less secure, alliances become temporary, and regional identity starts to matter more than any shared imperial claim. That same pattern appears across the continent in different ways. In High Rock, power remains divided among competing kingdoms and noble houses, so unity is always partial. In Hammerfell, conflict and a growing sense of separate national identity push the province along its own path. In Morrowind, Skyrim, and the Somerset Isles, local traditions continue to shape politics even when larger conflicts pull them into broader struggles. Trade, diplomacy, war, and religion all become more regional because there is no lasting central authority to organize them on a continental scale. Even later attempts to rebuild empire begin from a world that has already learned to function without one. The rise of the potentates shows how unstable authority has become. Even when someone sits on the throne in Cyrodiil, that does not mean Tamriel is truly unified. Rule is provisional. Power exists, but it is constantly challenged and often only reaches as far as an army or alliance can enforce it. Black Marsh remains especially resistant to outside control, and in many other places, local customs and long-standing loyalties survive whatever imperial system claims to govern them. The idea of empire still matters, but the empire itself keeps breaking apart. That is why the Second Era feels less like one political story and more like a series of attempts to hold a fractured world together. That instability eventually leads to the Three Banners War, the major conflict of the late Second Era and one of the clearest examples of the era's logic. During the time of the Elder Scrolls Online, the Aldmeri Dominion, the Daggerfall Covenant, and the Ebonheart Pact emerge as the largest competing blocks in Tamriel. Each presents itself as a solution to chaos. The Dominion is built around elven unity and older ideas of authority. The Covenant brings together human kingdoms under a shared political framework. The Pact is more uneasy and more practical, formed by groups that need one another to survive in a dangerous time. The war matters because it shows how little has changed since the fall of the Riemanns. Tamriel is still trying to answer the same question: who has the right to rule it? And every answer still depends on force. No faction can claim legitimacy without the ability to defend it, and no attempt at unity lasts long enough to settle the issue for good. The Second Era keeps returning to the same cycle of consolidation, pressure, and fracture. Even the largest alliances are built under that pressure, which means they remain vulnerable to the same rivalries that destroyed earlier powers. By the end of the era, Tamriel is still recognizable, but it remains deeply divided. Several powers have risen, claimed authority, and failed to hold it for long. The Second Era leaves behind competing alliances, weakened borders, and a continent still searching for stability. The Third Era is the age of the Septim Empire, beginning with Tiber Septim's rise as he pulls rival kingdoms into a single political order. Through conquest, diplomacy, and the use of powers later generations still debate, he gives the empire its shape. From that point on, Tamriel is no longer just a patchwork of regional powers. It is held together by the Dragon Throne, imperial law, and the idea that one dynasty can keep the continent stable. That unity is real, but it is fragile from the start. The empire depends on strength at the center, and that strength is personal as much as institutional. Tiber Septim's legacy becomes so large that later rulers are measured against him whether they want that standard or not. The Septim line inherits an empire that is too wide, too diverse, and too politically complicated to govern through force alone. As the Third Era goes on, the empire becomes more bureaucratic and less adaptable, which helps it administer territory but leaves it slower to answer crisis. This is also an era where Tamriel's oldest structures still shape politics in the background. The towers tied to the world's deepest history are not just ancient relics here, but symbols of permanence and control. Different peoples understand them differently, but the same struggle runs underneath everything. Everyone wants stability, and everyone wants a future they can direct. Imperial power, Old Mary heritage, and the ambitions of the provinces all circle the same question: who gets to decide what endures in Tamriel? As the Septim dynasty ages, the weakness at the center becomes harder to ignore. The court grows more exposed to intrigue, and the empire becomes increasingly dependent on the ruler who sits the throne. That dependence is exposed during the imperial simulacrum, when Uriel Septim VII is removed from power and the empire does not produce a clean succession. Instead, Tamriel falls into confusion, rival claims, and political instability. The crisis shows how much of the Third Era still rests on the presence of a capable ruler rather than on a system strong enough to survive without one. It also shows how quickly imperial authority thins once the center is broken, with local powers, officials, and opportunists all moving to fill the gap. The later years of the era keep proving that fragility. In Morrowind, the return of the Nerevarine and the collapse of long-standing prophetic expectations shift the balance of power in ways neither the Empire nor the Great Houses can fully control. That matters beyond the province itself. It shows that religion, political authority, and old destinies are still active forces in the modern age. The Third Era is not a clean break from the past. It is the moment when the past keeps forcing its way into current events. Even where imperial rule exists on paper, it cannot erase older loyalties, older institutions, or the fact that Tamriel's deepest conflicts were never solved, only delayed. The final break comes with the Oblivion Crisis. Uriel Septim VII dies, Oblivion gates open across Tamriel, and the empire is pushed to the edge of collapse. This is where the old structure fails at the deepest level. The dragonfires go out, the Septim bloodline ends, and the barrier that had long stood between Tamriel and the Deadlands is gone. The crisis does more than damage the empire. It proves that the old arrangement can no longer guarantee survival. For a time, the empire still fights to hold together, but it does so without the dynastic certainty and sacred legitimacy that once gave it authority. By the end of the Third Era, the empire still exists, but it is no longer secure. Its founding dynasty is gone, its authority is weakened, and every province has reason to question the center. The era opens with conquest and consolidation, then closes with exhaustion and fracture. The Fourth Era opens after the Oblivion Crisis has already broken the old imperial order. Tamriel is no longer held together by the same center of power that defined the Third Era. The Septim line is ended, the dragonfires are extinguished, and the empire enters the age weakened and divided. What follows is not a recovery, but a long stretch of instability as every major power adjusts to the collapse of a ruling structure that had lasted for generations. One of the most important developments in the early era is the rise of the Thalmor and the Old Mary Dominion. The Dominion becomes the clearest rival to imperial authority, and the Thalmor use that position to expand their influence across the continent. Their rise matters because it turns an imperial crisis into a wider political struggle. The empire is tired and diminished, while the Thalmor are disciplined, ambitious, and ready to press their advantage. That imbalance shapes much of the era from this point on, because the conflict is not only about territory. It is also about legitimacy, and about which power still has the strength to define Tamriel's future. That struggle reaches its peak in the Great War between the Empire and the Old Mary Dominion. The war shows how much power the Empire has lost. It can still fight, but it can no longer dictate terms the way it once could. When the war ends, it does so through the White Gold Concordat, a treaty that preserves the empire only by forcing major concessions. Those concessions weaken imperial authority and leave the empire intact but constrained. The peace that follows is fragile rather than stable, because neither side is satisfied and neither side is ready to let the conflict truly end. The treaty also leaves deep resentment behind, especially in regions that see imperial compromise as betrayal. That weakness spreads into the provinces, especially Skyrim. There, the loss of imperial strength gives old tensions room to return. Local loyalty, resentment toward outside control, and competing ideas about sovereignty all come to the surface. The Civil War is not just a regional dispute. It is one of the clearest signs that the Empire can no longer hold Tamriel together as it once did. As imperial authority shrinks, each province has more reason to turn inward, and the continent becomes less united and more uncertain. At the same time, the Fourth Era is not only a political history, it is also the period when older mythic forces return to the center of events. The dragons reappear in Skyrim, and that changes the scale of the era completely. Their return connects the present day to Tamriel's ancient past, when dragons were part of the world's living order instead of a half-remembered legend. Their re-emergence shows that the past was never truly gone. It returns at the exact moment when the modern world is least prepared for it. The crisis is no longer just about who rules. It becomes a question of whether the world itself is slipping back toward an older and more dangerous shape. That is why the return of the Dragonborn matters so much. The Dragonborn is not just a warrior entering a political crisis. The role ties dragon blood, dragon power, and an older divine pattern to the present age. In a world where ordinary institutions are failing, the Dragonborn becomes the kind of figure the era seems to require, someone able to confront a threat that sits outside normal politics. The struggle is personal, but it also reflects the age as a whole, a broken order, an ancient enemy, and a new answer arriving only after the old systems have already failed. By the time Skyrim's story begins, these threads have converged. The Empire is weakened, the Thalmor are ascendant, Skyrim is divided, and dragons have returned to a world that had nearly stopped believing in them. The Fourth Era is unstable because nearly every system that once defined Tamriel has been tested at once: empire, province, religion, and history. From the Dawn Era to Skyrim, the pattern stays the same. The world is formed, broken, remembered in fragments, and rebuilt by people who only partly understand what came before. The Merethic and First Eras turn myth into history. The rise of the Empire brings order, then shows how fragile it is. The Oblivion Crisis and the fall of the Septim Line prove how quickly an age can collapse. By the Fourth Era, the old order still shapes Tamriel, but it no longer holds it together. That is why Skyrim feels less like an ending than a threshold. The dragons return, the Empire weakens, and new powers move into place. Old names still matter, but they no longer decide what comes next. Elder Scrolls history is not a straight line. It is a cycle of ascent, collapse, and return, where legend keeps becoming real again. Skyrim is the latest turn, not the final chapter.